Trump instilled fear in Cuba by putting on the table the possible deportation of up to 500,000 Cubans who entered the United States in recent years. And this Monday, May 25, 2026, the Havana regime feels the weight of the political bomb that could fall on the island. The pressure doesn't just affect those who live in fear of losing the right to stay in American territory. It hits the Cuban dictatorship hard, which pushed its own people out with hunger, blackouts, repression, and misery. But now it may be forced to take back a crowd the system has no food, jobs, or infrastructure to support. Trump and Marco Rubio know where to apply pressure. Cut down on immigration abuses, demand accountability from Havana, call for the release of political prisoners, offer direct aid to the people and prevent the castrist elite from using Cubans as a shield to negotiate relief without granting real freedom. What is Havana hiding behind the fear of these deportations? Why does the regime fear taking its own people back? How did Trump turn the migration crisis into a political weapon against the Cuban dictatorship? I'll tell you all about it in a moment. But now you'll want to be subscribed to the channel to stay well informed, real-time information, with the best journalistic quality you've ever seen. With Milson Alves, global standard of credibility. The information which is circulating in outlets covering Cuba indicates that the talks between Washington and Havana include the possible repatriation of up to 500,000 Cubans who arrived in the United States, mainly during the Biden administration. The former Democratic Congressman Joe Garcia stated that this would be one of the most difficult topics in the negotiation. The proposal is not an isolated one. It would be part of a larger package involving the release of political prisoners, economic reforms, political reforms, and compensation for confiscated properties, and a new relationship between the United States and the island. But the part that shook Miami, Havana, and the Cuban community was precisely the mass deportation because it affects family, work, residence, fear, and the future. Trump uses this issue directly because the entry of Cubans into the United States has exploded in recent years and has become a political problem for Washington. Many arrived through programs created or expanded under the Biden administration. Others crossed the border, and others are still in fragile immigration processes. For Trump, the message is that the era of the open door is over. The White House wants to review permits, end abuses of humanitarian parole, and separate those who entered legally from those with crimes, fraud, or removal orders. The Department of Homeland Security had already taken action against parole programs for Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans. And the Supreme Court allowed the government to proceed with ending these permits. This move paved the way for much greater migration pressure against Havana. The Cuban regime tries to sell the idea that it is a victim of Washington, but the reality weighs against the dictatorship itself. Cuba has lost population. It has lost productive capacity. It has lost young people. It has lost professionals. And it has lost trust. Now, when the possibility arises of receiving up to 500,000 people back, Havana trembles because it doesn't have jobs, food, energy, or the infrastructure to absorb this return. The dictatorship that pushed the people off the island can now be held accountable by those same people, and that accountability is cruel for the regime. It shows the Cuban crisis wasn't caused by those deported. It was created by decades of political control, a stagnant economy, repression, and privileges for an elite connected to power. The operation also sends a message to the communist leadership. Washington is not just discussing immigration, it's discussing power. Marco Rubio has already said that the chances of a negotiated agreement with Cuba are not high, precisely because the United States knows who they are dealing with. The Trump administration offered $100 million in humanitarian aid to the Cuban people with food and medicine. But they want this aid to go through trustworthy entities like the Catholic Church or independent organizations, not through the regime's military and business apparatus. This strikes at the heart of the Cuban machine because Havana wants to control everything: food, medicine, internet, foreign aid, money coming in, and people going out. Another serious issue is the internet. In the news that's circulating, the American offer includes support for connection outside the control of the Cuban state company. This bothers the regime because in Cuba, the internet is not just communication, it's social control. When there's a protest, the dictatorship cuts the signal, blocks information, and tries to prevent images from leaving the island. If Cubans have freer access to information, the dictatorship loses one of its most important tools for maintaining fear. That's why, when Trump puts aid, internet, and deportations on the same table, he's not just negotiating flights. He's messing with the gears that protect the Havana elite. Deportations have already started on a smaller scale. Between January and May 2026, according to a report that covered the case, the United States deported 612 Cubans in 18 operations. It's not the gigantic number of 500,000 yet, but it shows the direction. The American government is testing routes. It applies legal pressure, negotiates with third parties, and forces Havana to take a position. In February, a flight took 170 Cubans with criminal records to the island. This is symbolically significant because Cuba has historically resisted accepting certain deportees with criminal records or old convictions. The pressure also involves Mexico. In March, Reuters reported that a federal judge in Boston demanded explanations from the Trump administration about an alleged unwritten agreement by which around 6,000 Cubans had been sent to Mexico. This detail shows that Washington works on several fronts at the same time. When Havana doesn't receive, the United States looks for alternatives. When the courts question, the White House defends its immigration authority. When the dictatorship tries to buy time, Trump raises the political cost. Havana feels the blow because the export of Cubans is not just a matter of the American border. It's a social bomb for the island. Those who left Cuba often left family behind, sold their belongings, took on debts, crossed dangerous borders, or entered programs that promised temporary stability. If part of this group returns without a job, without housing, and without prospects, internal pressure may grow in neighborhoods, lines, government offices, airports, and social networks. The regime knows this. That's why it tries to turn any move by Trump into propaganda against the United States. But the narrative becomes weak when the Cuban people themselves know who destroyed the local economy. Meanwhile, figures connected to the economic backstage try to sell a controlled transition with limited openness, foreign investments, and keeping power in the hands of groups close to the Castro elite. This is the most sensitive part. Havana wants money, tourism, properties, ports, roads, and investments, but it doesn't want to give up real political freedom. It wants to receive relief without losing control. Trump knows that, Rubio knows that, and the Cuban community in Miami knows that too. That's why the return of up to 500,000 Cubans becomes an uncomfortable obstacle. If the regime wants to negotiate, it will have to face the human cost of the crisis it created. Either Havana accepts the pressure and makes room for real changes, or it admits to the world that it can't even take its own Cubans back. I'm Milson Alves, Global, an internationalist, and my purpose is to keep you well informed and tell you the truth every day. The news links are in the video description. Leave a like on this video, subscribe to the channel, and at the end, check out the comments so you can be even more engaged with the Milson Alves Global community.